The theory of evolution claims that every kind of plant and animal arose from the first cell, morphing from one kind into another. That is called macroevolution. Evolutionists sell their theory to the public by talking about microevolution, tiny changes such as the color of moths or beak size on finches, implying that little by little animals morph into new kinds. But little changes go back and forth, and there is a limit to change for absolutely everything. To get beyond that, evolutionists rest all their hopes on mutations in the genetic code leading to new structures and functions to make every type of plant and animal that ever existed. That gets real complicated real fast. It is easy to show that macroevolution is physically impossible. Many people over decades have done that. I have explained it in a long article and 2 videos. And new discoveries in biology have made it even more obvious. Look at orphan genes. If an animal has, say, 30,000 genes, 10 to 30% of them, or 3,000 to 9,000 genes, are orphan genes, unique to that type of animal and no other at all, anywhere. That is way, way too many for gradual change, and it applies to every type of animal studied so far. That's right, every type. Ask an evolutionist for a sequence of mutations that invent the metamorphosis of a caterpillar to a butterfly, and they have no idea. Ask for fossils showing the gradual morphing of complex invertebrates, such as starfish to fish, and they've got nothing. Mutations deform, they don't build. Macroevolution is not happening today, and no fossils caught it in progress. But it wasn't some biochemistry experiment that convinced people to believe in evolution. When has anyone ever seen mutations make a new part, like inventing feathers on horses? For over 60 years, evolutionists have breathlessly told students about Stanley Miller's 1953 experiment that left some amino acids in a tar at the bottom of a flask. When have they ever done an experiment where mutations made a shell for a wolf or anything that leads to a new animal? Never, because it's physically impossible. No, people were enticed by a simple illusion that all the living things that ever existed in the world are related to each other, descending through a long line of morphing ancestors that can be drawn on a family tree, a tree of life. The mind can imagine anything, so with a sudden flash of insight you see the whole world differently. And wrong. When you are marketing a new product, it really helps to start with what people already know. And everyone has a family tree of ancestors with different appearances, personalities, and abilities. People understand descending from parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on into the distant past. So it is easy to make people see all living things as related through descent. Next they add illusion number 2. Given enough time, anything is possible. In reality, the physically impossible remains impossible, no matter how much time passes. It's very clever. Magical things happen around us all the time. Tiny seeds fall to the ground and all by themselves grow into marvelous trees or other plants. The most complex thing in the world, the human brain, forms automatically from a microscopic fertilized egg. They tell you that over millions of years some descendants of an unknown ancestor morphed magically into reindeer, and others into whales. Some descendants of an unknown ancestor morphed magically into elephants, and others into manatees. Some descendants of an unknown ancestor morphed magically into tree shrews, and others into apes. 3 evolutionary biologists wrote, "We recognize events such as the invention of muscles and neurons, or the evolution of segmented bodies, hormonal control systems, and centralized brains as major changes. While we are certain that these transitions did take place in deep branches of the animal tree, we often do not understand how they occurred, and have difficulty in reconstructing functional intermediate steps taken during these transitions." In other words, they believe morphing happened, they just can't imagine how. But that doesn't faze the evolutionist. So what if we don't know exactly how it happened? We have scientists working on it, and they will figure it out. Evolution is a fact. Let's just skip the molecular stuff for now and go right to the family tree, the tree of life, to the stories. And that is illusion number 3, evolve to. This is really sly. Evolutionary stories are all imagination, but evolutionists call them hypotheses or theories because that makes them sound scientific. Biologist Franklin Harold wrote in The Way of the Cell, "There are presently no detailed Darwinian accounts of the evolution of any biological or cellular system, only a variety of wishful speculations." They might as well say it was magic, because evolution theory cannot design anything, and macroevolution is physically impossible. If you believe in evolution, you believe in magic, and the gates of your mind open wide to evolution stories. Things may look designed, evolutionists tell us, but that's an illusion. They evolved by a series of random mutations and natural selection for traits that happen to have a survival advantage. Yet their actual words sound like tales of talking animals planning their inventions. Reporters and evolutionary biologists often write as if animals determined ahead of time what they would do. They simply take a real observation and weave a story around it. Like this. According to the evolutionist timeline, modern mammals and snakes big enough to eat mammals evolved at about the same time, 100 million years ago. Our primate ancestors evolved good close-range vision, mainly to find and avoid dangerous snakes. You see what they're doing? People invent things to do something. Somebody invented pencils for writing and erasing, screws and screwdrivers to connect things, cars for transportation. Officially, evolutionists admit that mutation natural selection can neither plan nor move toward a goal. Evolution theory is not capable of inventing something for the purpose of doing something, but they put it in every evolution story anyway. Evolutionists call them strategies, such as, the bat developed the strategy of sonar to catch insects. No, no, cries the evolutionist. Nothing is made for a purpose. New inventions just emerge over millions of years of mutation, natural selection, trial and error, guided by the pressures of the environment. They talk about populations of cells that evolved in response to different adaptive pressures, you see. Virtually everything in plants and animals has an obvious purpose, so they sneak purpose into their stories like this. The exoskeleton is likely to have been a key feature in the establishment of the arthropod body plan. It provides protection and leverage for muscles, but also prevents growth and breathing. The arthropod ancestors evolved solutions to these problems. They exploited molting, which allows them to replace the exoskeleton by a larger one as the body grows. And many arthropods also evolved specialized surfaces for gas and ion exchange. This shell is so tight, I can't grow or breathe. We need to evolve solutions. Great, how do we do that? We invent molting and specialized surfaces for gas exchange. Let's get to work on that right away. And they lived happily ever after. See how easy that is, and published in the prestigious Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. No need for hard work in a biochemistry lab. This is what evolutionary biologists do, make up stories and get treated like real scientists. If you have talent writing children's stories but are worried the field is too competitive, think seriously about a career in evolutionary biology. Let's try it. For thousands of years, pigs have been slaughtered for food. Today it is by the millions. Mighty dangerous for pigs. So environmental pressure is driving pigs to evolve wings to fly away to safety. Is it science or hogwash? Evolutionists imagine that there was an ancestor of primates, that it was a small creature that came out at night. They lived on the ground, but then they moved to trees. When you live in trees, you need to evolve grasping hands to cling to branches, and forward-facing eyes to judge distance. So we evolved forward-facing eyes and hands with an opposable thumb to grasp things, and flat nails instead of claws. Almost all primates did. But another evolutionist said it can't be that simple. Many mammals have chosen to live in trees and thrived without ever evolving these features. Squirrels have sideways-facing eyes and claws instead of nails, but they easily leap from branch to branch. So there must be more to our eyes and hands than that. They might be there for catching insects, he said. The position of primate eyes is best for judging short distances, whether an insect is within arm's length rather than whether a branch is within leaping range. But another evolutionist said it wasn't about hunting insects. Forward-facing eyes evolved to help animals see in clutters of leaves and branches. So once it decided to live in trees, a primate might have evolved forward-facing eyes to see through all the leaves. But the teeth of supposedly early primates are flat, round molars, better suited to grinding fruit and plant material than for eating bugs. So another evolutionist came up with the idea that primates and flowering plants evolved together. When the first primates evolved, say, there were forests full of flowers, fruit, and insects that would lure primates in the ground to come live in the trees. The plants evolved flowers full of nectar and big, juicy fruit that attracted primates, which in turn pollinated their flowers and spread the seeds. The primates evolved grabbing hands and feet, fingers and toes with nails and sensitive pads that helped them to move around delicate branches. Isn't that precious? The Massachusetts Institute of Technology loves evolution, but they schedule a festival to laugh at some evolutionary stories. 7 lectures amuse listeners with internally coherent, even convincing, but ultimately hilariously absurd, explanations of evolutionary adaptation, and ludicrous conclusions supported by careful evolutionary explanations. According to the website, the Festival of Bad Ad Hoc Hypotheses, BAH, is a celebration of well-argued and thoroughly researched, but completely incorrect evolutionary theory. They imply that other evolutionary stories are true. Well, I've been reading such stories for decades, and they are all pretty goofy. Evolutionists have long wondered why humans are not covered with fur like all the apes. Darwin thought that men chose hairless females, but a female evolutionary biologist thinks that's ridiculous. Of all the thousands of mammal species, it is hard to believe that the males of just one species would develop an arbitrary preference for balder-bodied females, or that in just one species of primate, it was the male's preference that decided the issue, she wrote. A 1924 explanation said that when our ape ancestors came down from the trees to hunt in grassland, they got rid of their hair to prevent overheating, but there was no explanation for the loss of female body hair. In 1970, an evolutionary biologist argued that humans would never have evolved in grassland with so little hair, so much sweat, and needing to drink so much water. The female evolutionary biologist pointed out that lions, cheetahs, and other grassland hunters kept their hair. Now, most evolutionists imagine man evolved in the woods. Another evolutionary biologist thought that being hairless was a trade-off for evolving a bigger brain. Others thought it was easier to remove ticks from skin without hair. Recent thinking has humans losing their hair when they started to walk upright. One story that has had evolutionary biologists arguing for decades is that humans got hairless because they started living near rivers and lakes. That's right, humans are amphibious apes who lost their fur, started to walk upright, and developed big brains because they began living by the water's edge. It's the aquatic ape theory. An evolutionary biologist observed that humans have big brains, a layer of fat under the skin, and a descended larynx, features common among aquatic animals, but not apes. To keep their heads above water, they evolved an upright stance, freeing their hands to make tools to crack open shellfish. Then they lost their body hair, and instead evolved a thick layer of fat under the skin to keep warm in water. Humans have large sinuses behind our cheeks, nose, and forehead. But why do we have empty spaces in our heads? It makes no sense until we consider the evolutionary perspective. Then it becomes clear. Our sinuses acted as buoyancy aids that helped keep our heads above water. I think that wading in a watery environment is as good an explanation for our upright gait as any other theory for human bipedalism, an evolutionary biologist said. But the whole aquatic ape package includes attributes that appeared at very different times in our evolution. If they were all the result of our lives in watery environments, we would have to have spent millions of years there, and there is no evidence for this, not to mention crocodiles and other creatures would have made the water a very dangerous place. On the other hand, DHA, an omega-3 fatty acid that boosts brain growth in mammals, is abundant in seafood. That is why a dolphin has a much bigger brain than a zebra, though they have roughly the same body sizes. Without a high DHA diet from seafood, we could not have developed our big brains. We got smart from eating fish and living in water. Why zebras evolved their characteristic black and white stripes has been the subject of decades of debate. Now, evolutionary biologists from Hungary and Sweden claim to have solved the mystery. Zebras hate blood-sucking flies. In experiments, narrow stripes make zebras unattractive to the flies, so the stripes evolved to keep away blood-sucking flies. Another group of evolutionary biologists wrote a paper that says zebra stripes evolved to dazzle predators because they create optical illusions when zebras move. This helps to protect the animals from killer cats as well as tiny insects. Zebra stripes have long confused evolutionary biologists right back to Darwin and Wallace, said the lead author. We suggest that these illusions cause pests and predators to mistake the zebra's movement direction, causing biting insects to abort their landing maneuvers and chasing predators to mistime their attacks. Evolved to keep away flies, evolved to confuse predators and evolutionary biologists. If striping is such a great strategy, why didn't wildebeest and antelope evolve it? Why aren't all members of the horse family striped, when they also have to deal with predators and biting insects? How did the first stripes on zebras originate by mutation? How did stripes become so regularly spaced and uniform over the entire body? Asking broader questions like these shows how contrived the stories are. Saying bats evolved sonar to catch moths in the dark is like saying a canvas evolved paint to portray mythical scenes. You don't need an artist. It just emerges. Paint falling onto a canvas without an artist just makes a mess. Mutations, environmental pressures, isolation, long periods of time could never invent sonar in bats, whales, or anything else. Once you understand, you see how childish these evolutionary stories are. Only a super genius could invent and install sonar, eyes, hands, eye-hand coordination, balance, brains, language, life. Evolutionists say these only look like they are designed. Yes, they really, really do look designed. And the invention of each design is impossible without a designer. The magical fantasy world of evolution isn't science. It's a cult that pretends to be scientific. People join the cult when they believe the illusions that morphing made every type of animal, anything is possible with enough time, and evolved two stories. Evolutionary science, evolutionary biologists, what a joke. Don't be a sucker. Crushing evolution theory is fun and easy. For 50 pages of it, visit Debunking Evolution. Here are top creationist arguments. There are two parts to evolution. Microevolution is variation, and macroevolution is morphing from one kind of creature to another. Microevolution is quite real, but it is just variation, such as the different breeds of dogs. Macroevolution, on the other hand, is just a mental fantasy. It cannot happen. When talking to the public, evolutionists talk microevolution. That's how they sucker everybody into believing the rest of it. All their experiments deal with variation and adaptation, though they try to pass a few off as macroevolution. But every creature has limits to how much it can change. To morph beyond the limits, mutations in DNA would be needed to provide novel genes and epigenetic RNA. Living things are intricate biological machines of mind-boggling sophistication. Mutations in their codes cause problems. If you are typing and hit the wrong key, the message is confused. You know that a mutation in your computer would damage it. Lots of mutations would destroy it. An evolutionist believes it just might improve it. For evolutionists, mutation is not only important, it's all they've got. Invention by accident. Accident piled on accident to create all the elaborate biological machines that ever were. Evolutionists like to call it the law, not theory of evolution, the very foundation of biology, that made every type of plant and animal that ever was, one morphing from another, all based on mutations beyond the limit of variation. It would take many constructive mutations to make just one new part and integrate it into an animal over a very long time. Unfortunately for the theory of evolution, while there are cases of parts disappearing from animals, no new parts have ever been detected under construction in any of the millions of plants and animals in the world. Yet if evolution is ongoing, there should be thousands. Just show some to the world and the battle with creationists would be over. But in 150 years, they got nothing. For macroevolution to happen, there would have to be a natural force that invents and builds, but there isn't one. There is the opposite, a tendency to disintegrate. It is called, yes, the second law of thermodynamics, or the law of entropy, which is a measure of disorder. It reads, a natural process always takes place in such a direction as to cause an increase in the entropy or disorder of the system plus the environment. In the case of an isolated system, it is the entropy of the system that tends to increase. When they hear that, evolutionists immediately say, that only applies to closed systems and biological creatures are open systems, as if they know what they are talking about. Since most people know nothing about this, the discussion is over. Here is the reality. The second law is defined in terms of an isolated system for the sake of simplicity, but there are no isolated systems in nature. It applies to every situation, all systems. This is from the textbook Biological Thermodynamics, Cambridge University Press. Most scientists consider the second law of thermodynamics the most universal governor of natural activity that has ever been revealed by scientific study. The second law says that no natural process can occur unless it is accompanied by an increase in the entropy of the universe. The second law demands ever-increasing disorder. Evolution theory claims to build complex life forms, but how can there be a process in which life forms become increasingly complex where the second law operates, which is everywhere? There can't. Here is an expert on thermodynamics. Ilya Prigogine co-founded the Center for Thermodynamics and Statistical Mechanics in Austin in 1967. That year he also returned to Belgium, where he became director of the Center for Statistical Mechanics and Thermodynamics. For his study in irreversible thermodynamics, he received the Rumford Medal in 1976 and in 1977 the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. He made it clear that the chance of molecules assembling themselves together to create life forms is vanishingly small. Vanishingly small is how scientists say impossible. He wrote, the idea of spontaneous genesis of life in its present form is therefore highly improbable, even on the scale of billions of years. Ilya Prigogine co-authored a paper in 1972 that says essentially, in an open system, crystals can assemble themselves, but unfortunately this principle cannot explain the formation of biological structures. All the second law is saying is that entropy, like time, moves in one direction. Time moves from present to future, the natural world moves from concentration to diffusion, from order to disorder. To counter this natural trend and accomplish work, mechanical, electronic, and biological machines are needed, but they have to be created by an intelligent creator, man or God. In 1859, the great scientist Louis Pasteur settled the question of whether life can arise spontaneously from chemicals. His experiments showed that life only comes from life by reproduction. It was the same year Darwin's book on the origin of species was published, and of course evolution requires that life on Earth began by assembling spontaneously from chemicals. Without the spontaneous generation of life from chemicals, evolution could never begin. Most evolutionists refuse to talk about this at all. These days, scientists speculate that RNA, not DNA, was key to the origin of life. But RNA is difficult even for biochemists to make outside of a living cell. It falls apart easily and its abilities are limited. RNA is not such a good candidate for the origin of life. In 1953, Miller and Urey became famous with an experiment that made a few types of the building blocks of proteins, amino acids. No doubt your science teachers made a big deal of this, leaving you with the impression that it was the first step in the glorious discovery of how life arose from chemicals. They probably didn't mention that the search has been a failure. As veteran origin of life research biochemist Robert Shapiro put it, the origin of life field has been short on progress over the past half-century. In fact, the futile struggles of origin of life researchers over the last 60 years have virtually proved that it is impossible for evolution to get started. To recap, there are two completely different parts to evolution theory. Microevolution is just variation, like breeds of dogs, and macroevolution is the mental fantasy that one type of creature morphs into a different type of creature. The second law of thermodynamics prevents morphing, the spontaneous appearance of new types of molecules, cells, tissues, networks, etc., that form novel creatures. Left to themselves, objects and chemicals cannot organize into these machines, so macroevolution is physically impossible. If something is physically impossible, it doesn't matter how much time passes, it is still impossible. Origin of life research over the last 60 years has confirmed what Louis Pasteur established by scientific experiment, that life could never arise spontaneously from chemicals and evolution could not begin. End of story. It leaves only one possibility, that all living things on Earth came from an extraordinarily powerful living intelligence who designed and created life and great beauty. Hey, I'm just saying. Crushing evolution theory is fun and easy. For 50 pages of it, visit Debunking Evolution. People often say evolution is science. The reality is that the theory of evolution is obsolete science. Discoveries in molecular biology over the last 40 years have revealed many secrets of how biology really works, and it hasn't been good for evolution theory. But most people have not heard it because there has been a concerted effort to promote evolution as not just a theory but a law of science, and to prevent discussion of scientific problems with it. Here you will see evidence that is fatal to evolution theory. Biologists divide all living things into groups and subgroups. The basic framework is the Linnaean system of taxonomy, published in Linnaeus's expanded 10th edition of Systema Naturae in 1758. That was a century before Darwinism, and it was never intended to show that one creature morphed into another. It just grouped animals with similar characteristics. But once they seized control of the study of biology, evolutionists took over the Linnaean system and have tinkered with it ever since, to fit their belief that animals transform over time. Here is an evolutionist with experience in molecular biology. Francois Jacob won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1965, along with two others, for discoveries concerning genetic control of enzyme and virus synthesis. His life's work dealt mainly with the genetic mechanisms existing in bacteria and bacteriophages, and with the biochemical effects of mutations. He wrote, "Evolution does not produce novelties from scratch. It works on what already exists, either transforming a system to give it new functions, or combining several systems to produce a more elaborate one. Once life had started in the form of some primitive, self-reproducing organism, further evolution had to proceed mainly through alterations of already existing compounds. New functions developed as new proteins appeared, but these were merely variations on previous themes. A sequence of 1,000 nucleotides codes for a medium-sized protein. The probability that a functional protein would appear de novo by random association of amino acids is practically zero. In organisms as complex and integrated as those that were already living a long time ago, creation of entirely new nucleotide sequences could not be of any importance in the production of new information." For decades, everyone agreed, but recently researchers have compared the genes of similar creatures, and they found that the genes differed from just a little to a lot. They imagined different ways the genes could have morphed. Evolutionists do not know what really happened. They assume it was one of these mental explanations, and that is enough for them. But some genes are so unique even imagination fails. Orphan genes are defined as genes which lack detectable similarity to genes in other species. They typically make up 10 to 30% of all genes in a genome. In fact, all genome and expressed sequence tag projects to date in every taxonomic group studied so far have uncovered a substantial fraction of genes that are without known homologs. These orphans, or taxonomically restricted genes, are defined as being exclusively restricted to a particular taxonomic group. Evolutionists now conclude they must have assembled spontaneously, de novo. The foundation of evolution theory, gradual modification over time, slowly transforming genes that already exist, suddenly ran up against orphan genes, genes without parents, in every taxonomic group studied so far. Looking at it objectively, the theory of evolution has been falsified. After careful study, evolutionists made a bold choice. They cut the theory's last connection to reality, declaring that the impossible is normal. Of course genes are produced de novo. The new foundation of evolution theory is, poof, there it is, which sounds like the foundation of creation by intelligent design, de novo. Evolutionists now think orphan genes are awesome. What choice do they have? For evolutionists, their theory can never die. The rest of us can see that Francois Jacob was right. Genes are long information programs for building proteins that construct, operate, and regulate parts of living things, integrated into all their other systems. Genes just can't pop up out of nowhere. Orphan genes in every living thing prove that macroevolution does not represent reality and is physically impossible. It's not just genes popping up on evolutionists' imaginary tree of life. Whole parts do too. Moving up the tree, you see that parts can be lost from a creature and then exactly reinvented in the same creature millions of years later. And that might happen several times. What's more, the same part might appear independently in unrelated creatures isolated from each other. For example, they imagine wings evolved completely independently 4 times in insects, flying reptiles, birds, and bats. This gimmick is quite common in evolutionary science. When a creature produces light with chemicals, it is called bioluminescence. Evolutionists think bioluminescence evolved independently 40 to 50 separate times. In another study, evolutionists concluded that the cecal appendix evolved independently at least 32 separate times in mammals. By the way, it is now known that the appendix is a safe house for important gut bacteria when the intestine gets infected and flushed. Evolutionists called it useless. Wrong again. It would be shocking if random mutation, natural selection, produced anything functional, let alone the same thing twice or more from scratch. Reinventing parts over and over again leaves the foundation of the theory of evolution, descent with modification, in tatters. How did evolutionary scientists escape this dilemma? They gave it a name with the word evolution in it, either convergent or parallel evolution, according to the situation. Need a part out of the blue? Just call it convergent or parallel evolution. It's everywhere in evolutionist writings. They just casually throw out statements like, convergent evolution is widespread across the mammal tree of life. It's not just parts popping up on evolutionists' imaginary tree of life. Whole animals do too. The most brazen example is the parallel evolution of the two types of mammals, placentals such as humans, and marsupial such as kangaroos. Evolutionists tell us that each group evolved separately, yet many are remarkably similar, including cats, mice, wolves, moles, flying squirrels, anteaters, and others. This is whole animal duplication, not just an individual part. A normal person would be embarrassed if their theory of random change made such claims, but you cannot embarrass a fanatic. The only reason for the convergent parallel evolution maneuver is to force the tree of life framework onto a world of uniquely designed creatures. The big surprise in the fossil record is right at the beginning. If the first living thing was a single cell, as evolutionists believe, then there should be a long series of simple, tiny creatures morphing gradually into bigger and more complex creatures over hundreds of millions of years. So what do we find in the first layer of fossils above the bedrock? The Cambrian explosion. The long trail of evolution is nowhere to be found. The fossils of the Cambrian explosion are complex invertebrates, sea creatures like trilobites, sponges, worms, jellyfish, sea urchins, sea lilies, mollusks, brachiopods or lampshells, sea cucumbers, and swimming crustaceans such as Opabinia, 3 inches long with 5 eyes and a long claw arm, and Anomalocaris, 3 feet long and the top predator in the Cambrian. Darwin understood the situation, but argued that the incompleteness of the fossil record in his day gave the illusion of an explosive event. He hoped that future discoveries of older and better preserved rocks would contain the long trail of early evolution. Wrong again. After 150 years of searching, we still have the Cambrian explosion. In the classification system biologists use, these animals are so unrelated to each other that they are in different classes or even phyla. In fact, virtually all of the phyla and classes on Earth are in the Cambrian explosion. From the early Paleozoic onward, there is little addition of new phyla and classes. Little high-level morphological innovation occurred during the subsequent 500 million years. If evolution were true, there would have been ancestors and transitional creatures between each genus, family, order, class, and phylum in the layers below the Cambrian explosion. But there are no fossils for any of them. This has been a constant, nagging problem for evolutionists that had to be solved. Finally, a team of evolutionists did it using their most effective tool, storytelling. First, they assumed evolution occurred. Then they estimated how fast it should have happened, and decided that the creatures in the Cambrian explosion had been evolving for over 250 million years before any showed up in the rocks as fossils. Yes, millions of generations of all kinds of creatures, all over the world, living, dying, evolving, without leaving any trace of their existence. Their story was published in the prestigious journal Science, and hailed as having solved a mystery challenging evolution theory all the way back to Darwin. That is how evolutionary science works today. They tell us stories of what happened. If the consensus of evolutionary science says it, it must be so, though they can change it later. If you don't like it, you must be a creationist and a threat to civilization. For those who can still think for themselves, consider the Cambrian explosion, orphan genes, and the fraud of convergent and parallel evolution and ask yourself, why are we still talking about this antique Victorian fairy tale, the theory of evolution? Hey, I'm just saying. To marvelous trees or other plants. The most complex thing in the world, the human brain, forms automatically from a microscopic fertilized egg. They tell you that over millions of years some descendants of an unknown ancestor morphed magically into reindeer and others into whales. Some descendants of an unknown ancestor morphed magically into elephants and others into manatees. Some descendants of an unknown ancestor morphed magically into tree shrews, and others into apes. 3 evolutionary biologists wrote, "We recognize events such as the invention of muscles and neurons, or the evolution of segmented bodies, hormonal control systems, and centralized brains as major changes. While we are certain that these transitions did take place in deep branches of the animal tree, we often do not understand how they occurred, and have difficulty in reconstructing functional intermediate steps taken during these transitions." In other words, they believe morphing happened, they just can't imagine how. But that doesn't faze the evolutionist. So what if we don't know 1,000 genes are orphan genes, unique to that type of animal and no other at all, anywhere? That is way, way too many for gradual change, and it applies to every type of animal studied so far. That's right, every type. Ask an evolutionist for a sequence of mutations that invent the metamorphosis of a caterpillar to a butterfly, and they have no idea. Ask for fossils showing the gradual morphing of complex invertebrates, such as starfish to fish, and they've got nothing. Mutations deform, they don't build. Macroevolution is not happening today, and no fossils caught it in progress. But it wasn't some biochemistry experiment that convinced people to believe in evolution. When has anyone ever seen mutations make a new part, like inventing feathers on horses? For over 60 years, evolutionists have breathlessly told students about Stanley Miller's 1953 experiment that left some amino acids in a tar at the bottom of a flask. When have they ever done an experiment where mutations made a shell for a wolf or anything that leads to a new animal? The theory of evolution claims that every kind of plant and animal arose from the first cell, morphing from one kind into another. That is called macroevolution. Evolutionists sell their theory to the public by talking about microevolution, tiny changes such as the color of moths or beak size on finches, implying that little by little animals morph into new kinds. But little changes go back and forth, and there is a limit to change for absolutely everything. To get beyond that, evolutionists rest all their hopes on mutations in the genetic code leading to new structures and functions to make every type of plant and animal that ever existed. That gets real complicated real fast. It is easy to show that macroevolution is physically impossible. Many people over decades have done that. I've explained it in a long article and 2 videos. And new discoveries in biology have made it even more obvious. Look at orphan genes. If an animal has, say, 30,000 genes, 10 to 30% of them, or 3,000 to 9 animal. Never, because it's physically impossible. No, people were enticed by a simple illusion, that all the living things that ever existed in the world are related to each other, descending through a long line of morphing ancestors that can be drawn on a family tree, a tree of life. The mind can imagine anything, so with a sudden flash of insight you see the whole world differently. And wrong. When you are marketing a new product, it really helps to start with what people already know. And everyone has a family tree of ancestors with different appearances, personalities, and abilities. People understand descending from parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on into the distant past. so it is easy to make people see all living things as related through descent. Next, they add illusion number 2. Given enough time, anything is possible. In reality, the physically impossible remains impossible no matter how much time passes. It's very clever. Magical things happen around us all the time. Tiny seeds fall to the ground and all by themselves grow exactly how it happened. We have scientists working on it, and they will figure it out. Evolution is a fact. Let's just skip the molecular stuff for now and go right to the family tree, the tree of life, to the stories. And that is illusion number 3, evolve to. This is really sly. Evolutionary stories are all imagination, but evolutionists call them hypotheses or theories because that makes them sound scientific. Biologist Franklin Harold wrote in The Way of the Cell, "There are presently no detailed Darwinian accounts of the evolution of any biological or cellular system, only a variety of wishful speculations." They might as well say it was magic, because evolution theory cannot design anything, and macroevolution is physically impossible. If you believe in evolution, you believe in magic, and the gates of your mind open wide to evolution stories. Things may look designed, evolutionists tell us, but that's an illusion. They evolved by a series of random mutations and natural selection for traits that happen to